All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, July 11th, and what have you been thinking about recently? What's on your mind?
The upcoming trip to Russia. Your mother and I will be leaving for Russia in 11 days, but of course that's not really what we're here to talk about. So I guess one thing that has been in the news, or I've noticed it doesn't seem to have received the attention that it should. Is Trump is starting to slap tariffs on countries again. Every day I see something, there's a true social post and a threat or actually a declaration that a new tariff is going to be imposed. And I think we thought that this was over. The markets responded positively. I don't know that the markets have actually responded to this new round, but if he goes ahead with them and you never know with Trump, but if he does go ahead with them, I think that we're going to see another crisis in the bond market, for example.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the weaponization of the dollar, these sanctions that they place on countries. Maybe you can at first maybe just talk about how damaging that weaponization of the dollar was and what that weaponization exactly was, and then compare it to what we're seeing with tariffs. Is this something similar in terms of weaponization of the U.S. financial system?
Yeah, of course, it's not the financial system when we're talking about tariffs, but the trade system. But there is a similarity. The Yeah, the weaponization of the dollar. That what that really means is that the dollar and much more than the dollar, just the entire finan global financial system, which is dominated by the U.S. And the West, is the purpose, of course, is to facilitate trade, to just make it easier for every country on the planet to trade with every other country, or to transfer funds and so on and so forth. But the U.S. has taken advantage of its dominance of the system to punish certain countries, and it's done that over the years, but with increasing frequency recently. Two countries that certainly come to mind are Iran and Russia. Russia was cut off from the SWIFT system. That was supposed to be one of the sanctions from hell. That was supposed to really, um, bring about the collapse of the Russian economy. Yeah, clearly it didn't. Iran's been subject to similar sanctions and has survived. They clearly have suffered, but they have survived for years, for decades, really. So anyway, other countries see this happening, and I think probably the example of Russia, because it's such a big country, um, was particularly alarming to a lot of countries, and they began to they realized that they didn't realize earlier, because again, this is not the first time that the U.S. has done this. The U.S. has sanctioned. Um, what we saw some statistic, I think, a year or two ago, like a third of the countries in the world are under some form of U.S. sanctions, and they can use their control of the financial system to make those sanctions bite. Now, if this is weaponization. So if this weaponization had not taken place, most countries wouldn't give a thought. It's just like the SWIFT system and the dollar. That's like water and your plumbing. It's a public good. It's there available for anybody to use it, and why worry about that? But then if you see that, okay, let's just imagine we can continue with this analogy of the water in the pipes. If um, the city decides they don't like you because of your opinions, and they simply just they cut off your water one day, and they do that to some of your friends who have similar opinions, and then you realize, my God, I've got to look for some alternative source of water. So you begin to look at alternatives. You build a well or whatever. Maybe that analogy didn't help a whole lot, but normally you wouldn't think about it. What I'm just saying, it'd just be just automatic. But then you're forced to think about alternatives when you see this happening, and that's what's happening. And it's that was not the original impetus for the BRICS, as far as I know, but it has given a real push to the growth of the BRICS. because they are in the process of developing these, alternative systems, and they already have worked out kind of stopgap measures among themselves already that other countries can draw on their experiences to do the same if they become a target of the U.S. And they probably, again, most of these countries don't want to wait to become a target. They, say, hey, let's start diversifying now. We don't want to put all our eggs in the Western basket because we see what can happen. So, we see this general move away from the dollar and from the financial system, or at least in an attempt to, keep the other options open on the part of many countries around the world. So that, I think in a very broad terms is the weaponization of the dollar. Now, when you're talking about the trade system, then it's tariffs. Now, the in the past administrations have made use of tariffs, but not anywhere near to the extent that Trump is. It was generally it was more targeted. Maybe it was certain products or a certain sector in China. They would come to some ruling that China was selling this at below cost or had violated some rule, whatever it might be, and then that particular good or that particular sector was targeted, but not a general tariff. That wasn't the approach. Now there is sort of a similarity. It's just that I've noticed in the past, it's just like every economic measure that the U.S. would take, again, vis-a-vis other countries, was always punitive. That's the way that we tend to phrase things. It's just like, we must punish this country because they're not playing fair. It's never about, well, we need to protect our own industries. That's not the kind of language that's been used. And that seems to be, sometimes you hear the protection language in the Trump administration, but in general, especially these recent truth social posts from Trump, it's the same kind of punitive language, and even more bombastic in the case of Trump. But I would also say more spurious, like it's just not that they have violated some understanding related to trade, but rather, I don't like you because you persecuted my friend Bolsonaro, that kind of thing. 50% tariffs on Brazil. That's what we're getting. In other cases, it may be just that, okay, yeah, you guys sell too much stuff to us. We don't like that. We're going to slap, 25% on South Korea, 25% on Japan. And then there are a lot of other countries, of course, that have been, for various reasons, are being subjected to these tariffs. And it's just a very erratic fashion, announced through a Trump true social post. That's the kind of, it's really rather bizarre, and it should be, I find it, well, I can't say I've gotten used to it. We've been 6 months into this administration, but it's just really pretty wild. It's something that I don't think anybody could have foreseen, even from Trump, because looking at the first administration, it was, you got a lot of tweets, but you didn't get real actions like this. We're talking about really serious things, the fate of countries, the relationships between countries, and they could be potentially decided by a tweet made in a moment of anger,
Yeah. No, it's so crazy. It's so wild. I was thinking about that this morning. If we just take a step back and just look at the past decade in the United States, just the state of U.S. leadership. We have Trump, and then we have Biden, which was just it was insane that we had someone like Biden as president for so long, that everyone was aware of his cognitive impairments. And now we get Trump, who's just insane. He's just a wild man. And it's just, and it's comically abysmal. It sometimes makes me think that maybe we are living in a simulation, because how could this be possible? It's like the dev set up some sandbox for us and just turned the insanity level up to 100 to see what could happen. But what's so strange to me is that it's just the U.S. I remember as a little kid. It was just clear that U.S. number one, we're great. And there was just sort of this general consensus amongst the whole world that America was the greatest country in the world, the superpower. It's where everybody wanted to move to. Everybody thought it was produce cool movies, and American culture was being exported everywhere. And then it seemed like just in a blink of an eye, it just all evaporated. And you look at the leadership, and people are looking at the United States, and it's like, is this what the best in the world produces? Like, how does that happen? How does a country that has such a great reputation, okay, let's say prior 2001, I mean, even really just to take it 10 years ago, pre-Trump, Obama, it's like, how does it fall so quickly? It's just proof that how does our supposedly greatest system in the world, we had what was it, the end of history, all that, and then it produces this. It produces
Yeah.
Biden and Trump.
Right. Well, I wish I had an answer for you. I don't know that I do. I mean, it is hard to explain. That you can say one thing, that there were trends in place that they were in place before, let's say, the Trump's first election. First of all, there was a relative decline uh, between the U.S. and the rest of the world. When you look at by the end of the 1990s, or maybe especially the mid 1990s, there was just this huge gap. The U.S. was the sole superpower, so we called it a hyperpower. And but in that time, Russia was just really on the ropes back in the 1990s. But beginning with Putin's election in 1999, and then it began to recover, and it's recovered remarkably. And then, of course, China was just really beginning its recovery from the Cultural Revolution. It was still a very, very poor country in the early 90s, but now it's, there are pockets of poverty, of course, but overall it's a very, very prosperous country, and it's surpassed us in manufacturing. And that you can just say that it's true of much of the rest of the world too. These are just two, I think, the most obvious examples. So, there was a time when you could say, the U.S. is just by far ahead of the rest of the countries, according to many different measures. And that's just not true anymore. But that was a trend. I think that was inevitable. There's just no way that was a set of unique historical circumstances that put the U.S. in that position. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. But that changed. So part of it was just inevitable. We weren't going to be the hyperpower for forever. But then just the kind of people that are rising to the top, and the kind of the obsessions of this new elite, I find that hard to understand. I don't know if there's really a rational explanation for that. Maybe you can just say it's sort of a late empire kind of disease that, like you look at the fall of the Roman Empire and the kind of people that rose to the top. I'm sure all of us, even who have any sort of acquaintance with Roman history, know some of the names of the madness that began to kind of grip the central power there. And again, it's hard to explain. I guess part of it is maybe it's an outgrowth of that sense of being a hyperpower. It just kind of it atrophies the mind. If people lose a grip on reality, they get a sense, that we're talking about the elite in particular, that their power is unlimited, and they stop making these hard-headed calculations about what's necessary to maintain their power. It was, who was it, Karl Rove in the Bush administration that said we create our own reality. And in a sense, it was almost true back then. You could do whatever, virtually, the U.S. could do virtually whatever it wanted. Maybe not successfully, but it just go bomb a country without any consequences for itself. And if it was a failure, well, which it often was, to be honest, but you had the power of the media to just kind of spin it whatever way you wanted. So you just go on to the next, or to memory hole it, or and maybe that's another thing that's changed too, is that we just don't have that power of the media. It's not the same extent even within this country. Of course, it's been eaten away. People become skeptical. There are alternative sources of information, but that explains the diminution of American power, but it doesn't explain the kind of people that we have at the top, and the kind of the madness that has really gripped the country. And you just don't see any alternatives. Like, okay, I know there are Democrats who think, well, if we get our guy back in charge, but come on, you remember Biden, and Kamala Harris really wasn't any better. And then the Republicans, who are still championing Trump, but with, I think, less and less enthusiasm. The fact is, it's a bipartisan phenomenon. And it's just a reality, again, just, compare the quality of people that we have to the quality of people that govern China and Russia, for example. And there's just no comparison. They're just the Chinese and the Russians. Maybe you hate them, but you have to say that these people are much more intelligent, and they have a much firmer grip on reality than virtually any Western leader. It's not just the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I still don't understand. I mean, I guess there is
Yeah.
no explanation, but I mean, I remember the George W. Bush days, and everybody was making fun of him as some kind of buffoon. But he looks like Socrates now compared to what we have now. It's unbelievable to me that the decline can be so rapid. It makes me wonder, do you think it's in large part intentional? I mean, like with Biden, everybody knew that Bernie Sanders was the most popular person amongst the Democratic voters. And then Biden was the one put in. And maybe it's because they're like, okay, his mind's going great. We can manipulate him more easily. We can just push through whatever we want. And then, okay, people didn't want Trump because he sounded like he was going to be a fly in the ointment of the system and drain the swamp. But I think the deep state just realizes that actually Trump is very easy to manipulate. You just have to flatter him. You just tell him how great he is, how awesome he is, and then, okay, sure, yeah, start sending money here. Sure, I'll bomb that country for you. All right, Lindsey Graham, we'll do these tariffs or crushing sanctions or whatever. It's just, I don't know. Is it potentially intentional that there's this evil? I mean,
Well,
like, how do you produce? It just doesn't make sense. Like, we get so worked up over these elections, and you just look at
yeah,
the quality of our candidates. It's like, how are we getting
right.
so worked up over just, Dumb and Dumber here? It's just, I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that it's intentional in the sense that, that like the Democrats really wanted somebody suffering from dementia. For various reasons, they didn't want a Bernie Sanders who seemed like he was a kind of, a revolutionary, or he was
Do you
going to
think
make
it's
changes.
more his position on Israel than anything? I mean, he's kind of wishy-washy sometimes with Israel, but
Right. And on a lot of things, it's turned out, that he's been kind of a disappointment for people who thought that he was going to be a real alternative. But even so, he does actually stray from the mainstream narrative, and he does stand outside of the establishment, at least, on occasion. So they had their worries about him. They didn't want him, and they ended up rallying around Biden. Now, I don't know that they fully understood. They probably knew that there were cognitive problems, but it was limited and they could handle it. I think they miscalculated. They didn't understand how serious the problem was. And then they were stuck with them, and they just had to hide it. Now, in Trump's case, he wasn't the first choice of the Republican establishment, clearly. And so it was a real shock to the system, including the Republican establishment, when he was first elected. But he was really neutered in that first term of his. And I think that the Republican establishment in particular came to accept him, figured that they could work with him, and so he began to, they brought him in and made him part of the establishment. And when he was elected again, well, we had some surprises. People that were clearly outside of the establishment were nominated. I think we all know the names, or more than that, appointed. But clearly, I think the calculations that the Republican establishment made were correct. We can control this guy. And, maybe we would rather have somebody else, but we can control him. So we'll just have to live with him and work with him.
right. So we using these terms, establishment, that basically are deciding our political leaders here in the United States. But are we able to kind of define that a bit more? It's like as the establishment, is it like 40% Zionist, 20%, neocon or anti-China? Like what is that? Is the establishment making? What is their worldview? Because that's
Yeah.
clearly, they will only allow people to get into power that follow their view of the
Yeah.
world, follow their
Right.
ideology. Can you
Well,
define
well,
that?
when you're talking about Zionism, it's close to 100%. It's just a question of intensity, and for
For the
both,
establishment.
yeah, both parties too.
So it's
I
a
mean, again,
Zionist
when you get
establishment.
to yeah, when you get to foreign policy, there's really it's a bipartisan establishment, and yeah, you may it when it comes to Zionism, yeah, it's a question of like how passionately attached are you to it, or and what kind of rhetoric do you use. But in the end, it's pretty much unconditional support for Israel all across the board. I don't think there's really any exceptions. Um,
So is it hyperbole then to say that our country is owned by essentially Israel if it's Zionist, and that means you're putting the interests of another country ahead of your own, right? That's what
yeah,
Zionism is.
well, right. I mean, the thing is, it's not just in some cases you could say it's really Israel is kind of like a puppet master, and like through APAC and so on is directly controlling members of Congress. I think that's clear. We just know that's true, but it's not entirely. It'd be unfair to look at it entirely in those terms, because there is, especially like coming out of Christian Zionism, there are a lot of people that even absent those pressures coming from Israel, have this commitment to Israel. And so it's not just that it's like Israel's running the show, and if you cut the strings, everything would be fine. It would still go on. If Israel lost its influence, like you shut down APAC and so forth, there still would be something there.
Not
Quite
that
yeah,
much,
not as
probably,
much.
right?
No. So I'm saying like that statement, like the Israel runs, that's an overstatement, but it's not. But there is a lot of truth to it. I think that you just have to admit it, and that's again, people like great scholars like John Mearsheimer really have shown that very persuasively.
Yeah, it's so obvious now to everybody, especially just I don't know if it's just my Twitter feed, probably my X feed, but it just seems like in general everybody's waking. It's the fault of the Zionists themselves because they're calling everybody an anti-Semite now. They're I think they're panicking, to be honest. And we see these actions like do you know that UN human rights I
Yeah,
don't know if she runs
Albanese,
it.
Francesca
Francesca,
Albanese, right,
right?
right,
Like they're gloating. All these Zionists gloating online, like, yeah, that's what you get if you try to go against Israel. We'll get the U.S. to sanction you. It's like what? Like
yeah,
the United States is
yeah,
not. We didn't sanction her for saying anything about America or the United States. She's
right,
speaking out against what Israel's doing in Gaza, which everybody is aware of, and like this
right,
is a problem. No matter if I don't care if you want to call it a genocide or not. I think any decent human being can look at what's happening in Gaza and say that this is not an acceptable behavior for any country to engage in. This
right,
is not okay. This is
right,
not, especially if you say, like, oh, we're some Western civilized society. This is not a way any civilized society can perform. And I think everybody's realizing that, and it's just destroying the whole United States. But when we see these types of the open gloating of canceling people and trying to ruin people's careers because they are saying like we don't like what Israel's doing in Gaza. I think that's a bad move for the Zionists, right? Everybody's seeing that. Like, why are you doing this? And we can see them just pulling the levers on the United States. Like, okay,
yeah,
great, we canceled this person, and that. What does it mean when you sanction a person? We talked about sanctioning a country. Is she
yeah,
ruined? Like, is it a big deal if the U.S. sanctions a
yeah.
person?
Well, I think, like in her case, she probably can't come to. I know I've read some things about it, but I can't recall the actual sanctions that were imposed on. Often it is that, well, the person is actually not free to travel to the U.S. and is maybe even at risk in some cases of being arrested in certain countries that are very close to the U.S. I don't think that's true of her. They did the same thing to Khan, who was the head of the ICC, the prosecutor there, after he, brought charges against Netanyahu. Um, but I think they even farther, like they were going after his bank account. I don't know if they were successful with that, but it's quite extraordinary. They again, because of the U.S.'s dominance over so many parts of the world and so many international institutions, it can do a lot of harm to an individual if it really goes after them. So yeah, that's what we're looking at. I mean, um, but going just back to your point about how open they are, I think that's a real change, and it is a sign actually of their declining power. It used to be that they could operate within the shadows, and that again, if you pointed to Israel, or if you pointed to Jewish Zionists, or um, you were instantly an anti-Semite. This is crazy talk, but it's just like, as he's saying, it's coming out in the open, and they are being less and less subtle about how they exercise their power, and that's a sign that they are in trouble. And I think it's actually, by operating openly, and with in a more kind of brutal, I think maybe that, or blunt fashion, um, they're doing harm to themselves, and they're only going to actually, accelerate that process that we see taking place. So it is, they do have these organizations like AIPAC and ADL. They do have a reason for being nervous, again, and they are aware of the polls that they're losing. Even their, like Jewish young people are leaving them in droves, and they're aware of that. That's, but I don't think they have an answer to it, because it is the genocide, and they are not willing to halt that genocide. And so, this is going to continue to eat away at their support. So the answer is, well, okay, we don't change our behavior, but we just go after our opponents with even, greater viciousness. But you do that, and of course you exacerbate the problem. That's what we're looking at.
Right. Do you think there's any awareness that it's, I mean, clearly not. I don't know if it's just, how front and center do you think the Israeli issue is becoming to the average everyday citizen? I think a lot of people maybe didn't want to address it because maybe they're like, a little uncomfortable. I'm not following that closely. Let's just don't talk about it. But the more, like you're saying, that they're trying to combat it, and just they're pushing Israel and anti-Semitism front and center. I mean, I just see it constantly in my Twitter. It might be my algorithm. I understand, right. but I just feel like it's been increasing even more. That it's got to get to the point where now you're forcing everyday people to look at this issue. And if you're Israel, you don't want people to look at this issue because it doesn't look good. But maybe in their mind, they just fully think that, any rational person will think that we're the victim because we believe that so strongly. And
well, that's what's repeated again and again. That's, I think it was, what was it? The head of Google, one of these megacorp recently made just virtually that same statement. He said the UN was a transparently anti-Semitic organization, and the Israelis were the victims. Can't you understand that? But
don't
anyway,
cancel us, YouTube. That's what I'm worried about.
Right. Well, there is a danger. Okay. Yeah. Let's say. Yeah, you can say a danger of or a tendency, I think, sometimes to overestimate changes, because we operate within certain communities, and that's something like you're saying, you see these things online because you're part of that community, and the algorithms feed these things to you, and so that can give you a sense that there is this, the vast majority of people on your side, and that's not true. But the polls are showing a real shift, where we have now a majority of the population having a negative view of Israel. That's a huge change, it's a big change from a decade ago, and it's a huge change from a generation ago, where, this is something that's continuing and is probably going to accelerate. So it is getting through to the average person. Maybe they don't have a full understanding. I'm sure they don't. And they don't have their opinion is maybe not so passionately held. I'm sure that's true. But it is affecting their thinking, and that's going to have huge consequences down the road.
I know you're probably not going to like this question, but can you explain these consequences? This is where I always get lost. It's like, what does this end up doing at some point? Because it's like, I don't know if this is a good analogy, but just it's like if you're you're just a guy and you've been kind of feeling a little queasy sick, and then you go to the doctor and you realize there's a parasite in you. Well, now you realize there's a parasite and you're going to get it removed and taken out. I feel like the United States, people are realizing that there is something that has infected the United States and we want to remove it. And we're seeing what it is now. And it is this Zionist control. So can we get it out? I mean, how, I don't know if that was a good analogy, but you understand.
Yeah, maybe you want to be careful
But,
about that analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, don't want to take that too far.
Right.
But, yeah, well, it's, we already have a majority that has a negative view, but our policy hasn't changed at all. And that's something, well, it's the money and the, let's say, passion. This is an issue where there is clearly passion on both sides. Because the Zionists many of them are passionately Zionist, and that's one reason they make that. This is, some of these mega donors. I think it was Saban who was like the leading donor to the Democratic Party for a long time. He may still be, I haven't looked at it recently, but he said that he had, basically one issue, and that was Israel. And so you have people like this. So they when you combine that with the money and organization, that makes for a very powerful group that can really dominate politics. And plus, they've done the groundwork. They've groomed people. They have loyal members of Congress. They have loyal members like who was the current I guess CIA director. If you go way back, he had been really identified as an Israel supporter, like when he first entered politics and they established a relationship with him now, provided money, helped his career, and then here he is, in a real position of power in the administration. So you have that. They've done the groundwork, and it's something that goes back decades. So they've got this power, and it's just not going to disappear over time. Now, you have this shift. You do have, it has to be admitted, this passionate opposition to Israel and in particular, what it's doing to the Palestinians. And that is growing. So there is real passion on that side, but you don't have the power. You don't have the money. You don't have the organization. But these people will enter politics. And this will have, again, we're talking about a real shift among, across the political spectrum, particularly on the left, but on the right too. And very importantly, among, young Jewish people. So this is going to have huge consequences, but they're up against this establishment, and these kind of establishments don't fall overnight. Now the establishment is showing, it's fighting back. I don't think it's doing it very effectively, but it's fighting back, and it will continue to fight. And it may use increasingly undemocratic means, authoritarian means to maintain its power. They're not going to go down without a fight. We can see it in places like the UK. Where recently there was a group called Palestinian Action, I think it is, and they splashed some red paint on some planes at a air base in the UK, and then were declared a terrorist group. And then, according to UK law, you express support for this group, and then charges could be brought against you. That's what's happening. Now, meanwhile, support for the genocide is not a problem. Nobody gets in trouble with it. But people are seeing, the blatant injustice and double standard here, and it is, it is increasing the rate. So we're getting this. There's a potential. I've said this, I think, with regard to other issues, but certainly, with regard to Israel, it's an increasingly authoritarian and establishment against that is at odds with its own population, and that. We'll see where that leads us. I think in the end, you can't keep that up, but they might keep it up for a long time. They may just end up actually shutting down various avenues of democratic protest just to maintain control. That's what we're seeing already.
It seems like that type of authoritarian control is a little bit more easy to be exercised within Europe. Would you say that's true? Do you think that if
Yeah.
we get to that level in the United States, I mean, one thing is everybody here has got like 17 guns in their house. It's like, I mean, if it get, I mean, I know that's a lot of people don't like that argument, but I think there is a little something to that. If the government starts to push way, way too far, it's like, okay, this could get, people might take to the streets, and if everybody's armed, then that's a problem, right?
Yeah, well, that's okay. There's some truth to that. And then, um, the First Amendment in this country has been under attack, quite openly in some ways, and we found that censorship has been, exercised via these these media platforms. But all in all, the First Amendment still is a powerful force within the U.S. And but yeah, but you're right to point out that in Europe that's just not the case. They don't have the same tradition of protections for free speech. They have some clearly, but it's just weaker. And so you see the kind of things happening in Europe that so far haven't happened in the U.S. Not directly, not through any government control, but I just mentioned that case in UK, but you could find many, many other similar cases, and France, yeah, Germany, yeah, I mean throughout Europe, there is an open uh, suppression of free speech. You know, particularly with regard to these foreign policy issues, Russia and Israel, but also let's say on the question of immigration and so I guess yeah, we're the situation is worse in Europe as far as that goes. We do have still some bulwarks protecting free speech in this country. That's just the American way. But we've seen moves to limit that, and both openly academics writing about how we need to actually like reinterpret the First Amendment, that kind of thing, and politicians too. But and then there's the censorship that that has been exercised through private corporations. Maybe that has fallen back. I think as things are better under Trump than they were under Biden, but I don't think there's any guarantees. You can have, the Constitution in the end is just a piece of paper, and you have to have dedicated institutions and people supporting these liberties for them to survive. Um, I think you have to be more optimistic about the U.S. in that regard than Europe, but I don't think we can let our guard down. I think that again, there are a lot of powerful people that would like to circumscribe these rights, limit them, and have, and they're not going to be bound by the words of the First Amendment.
Right. I mean, like when the U.S. sanctions somebody like Francesca Albanese, like, what is their justification? Is it just because she's speaking out? I mean,
Yeah, well, that's
like,
clearly it. It's just that I
so
think clearly, like APAC or whatever, went to had their contacts. They had their contacts within the administration. They said, you got to shut this woman down. She's doing this damage. That's what
right.
happens.
I guess we don't, there definitely is I think they're trying to have some type of chilling effect. And it's something that we have to be conscious about, even just, the threat of being demonetized or be removed from a platform because you start to question some things or look at some things. So, and just we see people being deported for their support of Palestine. They're making it an issue where people are afraid to show really on either side, really, people it's just, they're trying to make this, it's something that you don't want to bring up, but everybody is aware of it now and has to talk about this issue. I just, I'm gonna move back a bit. I was just thinking about just when talking about sanctioning a person, and I'm gonna move back to what we were talking about at the beginning. We we've weaponized the dollar, we sanction people, but I was just thinking, and you're talking about going after that ICC guy's bank account. Is this part of sanctions as well? Freezing assets, like freezing. This is what I was kind of thinking about with the weaponization of the dollar when we froze Russia's assets. Is that just theft? Use that analogy of the pipeline, but are we actually taking sucking things out of their pipeline into to ours? Is that
Yeah.
part of sanctions, and is that another
Yeah,
tool? It's a
sure it is. We've done the same thing. We've frozen assets of many countries that we disapprove of. Venezuela, Iran, Afghanistan. Afghanistan, we seized billions and billions of dollars in this desperately poor country. You say, well, we don't like the Taliban. Okay, you don't like the Taliban, but that's going to affect the lives of ordinary people there. Very poor people are going to be further impoverished because of what you did. And yeah, no, that's a big part of it. And freezing it, it's basically theft. You haven't actually appropriated it and used it for yourself, though we're starting to see that happen with the Russian money. That's like there's clearly a certain amount of nervousness over that. It's just like, that's going to look really bad if we actually, take their money and use it ourselves. Then it's just open theft. What we've done is actually just like lock refuse to open the safe where we're keeping the money for them. That's really just sort of there's a difference there, but it's really not a very meaningful difference. I think you can call that theft too. When you freeze it and you just deprive the rightful owner of the use of the assets, what's from that other party's perspective, it's the same thing. It's theft. It's just maybe easier for them. Theoretically, they can get it back someday, or it'll be easier for them to get it back if you haven't actually given the money to somebody else or used it yourself. But yeah, it's that's one of the weapons in the arsenal, and that's part of the what we call it's an further example, yet another example of dollar weaponization.
why do we engage in this dollar weaponization? Is it actually working? Do we get what we want when we weaponize it? Have we seen it succeed?
Well, we have weakened countries that we don't like. Certainly Iran is a poorer country today because of these various sanctions, including asset seizures. Venezuela is poorer. The hope is that, okay, by impoverishing them further, by immiserating their populations, the people will rise up, and we'll have a regime that's friendlier to us. Now, I guess one place where you can say it was successful was Syria. Syria, again, was a much smaller and poorer country, and much of its land was already occupied by hostile forces, including its most productive land. And so it was hollowed out, and you could say that their strategy eventually worked. Now, they didn't succeed through elections, but it was actually through an invasion that came from the north, of an Al-Qaeda Turkey-backed invasion. But that's fine with us, In the end, we get a government there that is friendly to our interests and to Israel's interests. There's talk that actually there might be some kind of treaty between this new Al-Qaeda-led government in Syria and Israel.
That's so nutty to think that we had a $10 million bounty on this guy for terrorism, Al Qaeda, ISIS, and now Trump's like, he's a pretty tough hombre, good guy, now a good friend of Israel. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Oh yeah, but yeah, unless you really knew the history, and that the fact is that we have cooperated with Al Qaeda in the past. We cooperated with them; they're our enemy. It goes back and forth all the way back to Bin Laden and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. We have this long history of actually working with Al Qaeda, and certainly in Syria. But yeah, it was not just Al Jolani or Al Shara, whatever he wants to call himself now. But his whole organization, HTS, that was considered a terrorist organization, but recently has been redefined as hunky dory. It's
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Trump is officially Biden 2.0 when it comes to these wars, or potentially? I mean, I would say worse, more erratic, and we got these tariffs on top of it now.
Yeah. Well, it comes to the Middle East. I don't know that anything would have been different under Biden. The rhetoric would have been different. But I think probably Biden would have gone along with his plan just as well. Again, he was a very avid Zionist. He was a little bit, more cautious about what he said because he had a base to deal with that was becoming increasingly restive, right? But you just look, there's only a hair's breadth of difference between his policy and Trump's policy, and I think that we probably would be in the same place today under Biden. Now, a lot of the difference is really just rhetorical, and I know that like Professor Morandi has recently pointed out, and I think I pointed this out too earlier, that Trump, again, he says the quiet part out loud. He's like Biden did the same things, but he knew that you hope, to the extent that he was conscious at all, or at least his people like Blinken or whatever knew that you still you didn't say certain things out loud. You didn't say that you were actually intent on ethnically cleansing Gaza, for example. But Trump says those things out loud, and so in that way he kind of tears away the veil and lets people see the ugly face of the empire of U.S.-led global hegemony. And that is actually, in a way, it's a good phenomenon. It's accelerating the demise of the empire. Um, Now, when it comes to Russia, it's looking like these efforts at negotiation, as we predicted, really aren't going anywhere. And unfortunately, I think the Russians had a hope that there would be two tracks. They understood that probably there really wasn't any real hope for a negotiated settlement to the war, but at least the U.S. and Russia could improve relations, could restaff their embassies, maybe reestablish their direct flights, that kind of thing. But it was just a couple of weeks ago that the American side just called off. They'd had a series of meetings, and then the Americans, without explanation, said, "Okay, we're not going to have the next meeting. We're going to halt the work for the time being on improving relations." So the hope there is vanishing, and
So
yeah,
do
it's
you
kind of I think we are. Maybe Trump isn't quite there yet, but he is going to be Biden 2.0 when it comes to the Ukraine war, and I think we saw that. It's just his idea of ending the war was never realistic, and because he didn't have any, it wasn't bound on real or established on reality. It just wasn't going to go anywhere, and the war was going to continue, and it would end up being his war, and that's what's happening right now.
so do you see the United States getting more involved now in this war? It sounds
Yeah.
like.
Well, the thing is, we're already very much involved, and the intelligence gathering, just all. It's not just the weapons. The weapons obviously are a very important part of it. It's the intelligence, it's the training, it's the tactical advice, and so on and so forth. And none of those things have changed. The reconnaissance, the supportive communications. That never stopped. I don't think it ever did. Possibly it stopped for a day or two. What was it, back in March or something? But maybe not even then. There's really a question mark over that. So we have been supporting them and the weapons have continued to flow now. Until just very recently, those were Biden weapons that had been authorized under Biden. And Trump hadn't added to that because there probably really wasn't a need. And then there's also the problem. There's a limit to what we can supply. I think that's just the truth. But very recently, Trump authorized, I believe it was another $500 million, roughly, that of weapons to Ukraine. And so it looks like it'll continue to flow. Now, I think that flow is going to decrease, but it's not so much a matter of politics as of, simple production constraints.
Do you think that Trump is just doing this maybe because it's too messy for him, and he's like, okay, just put it on autopilot, just don't have the thing blow up on my watch. I don't want to hear about it. I mean, why would he come to this decision to stay involved in this war when he was so open about ending it? And so it's just like, I'll have this war done in 24 hours. We need to stop the bloodshed. I want to see people stop dying. this in a large part was why Trump was elected, was his open anti-war policies. But it's been
Yeah,
such a disappointment for anybody that would have voted for Trump based on the hopes for ending wars, for
right.
anti-war reasons.
Well, yeah, well, again, I think it was the answer is the primary answer is it's based on a misunderstanding of the situation. I think people around him were telling him that, look, Russia is in a real fix. Their economy is about to collapse. They're losing, um, well, actually, like 20,000 people a month killed. And it was just, I think, Rubio just the other day, maybe it was yesterday, said that 100,000 Russian soldiers have been killed so far this year. And maybe they really believe it, or enough of them do, or telling Trump that. And so he really thought that, okay, yeah, he ignored everything that the Russians were saying from Putin on down, saying repeatedly ever since June 14th of last year. These are our demands. He just simply ignored them. It's simply, hey, well, that's probably just a negotiating position. They're really desperate. Offer them a way out. They'll take it. Um, I saw a New York Times story just yesterday, and the title of the piece was "Putin messed up," and it was basically this: like Putin had this chance under Trump. Trump was willing to give him this off ramp, offer him a ceasefire, and how desperate, really, what shaky ground he was standing on, how fragile the economy is, and the terrible losses that they're suffering, and Trump gave him a way out, and he didn't take it because he's just so detached from reality. This was basically the argument that the New York Times was making. So it just seems like we've seen challenges to the narrative. We've seen information actually contrary to this point of view come out from places like the New York Times. Even occasionally there will be an article, and within the dissident or community or the alternative media, we tend to seize on those and look, things are really changing. They're waking up to it. And yeah, there are individuals. It's important, it's good to talk about these articles, but sometimes we forget that the narrative can be, impervious to this. And the average consumer or even the average member of the establishment, of the elite, they're still plugged into the narrative. And that's what that New York Times piece reflected. And I think that's probably true, just for Trump and the people around him. So you saw Trump getting really angry, Putin's feeding me this BS. Putin's been saying openly all along what his position is, but he's just assuming that, what they're telling us is true and that Putin really does want a deal. He's just desperate for it. And now he just understands, why is Putin being so unreasonable? He's mad. But if he actually had paid attention, and I'm sure it's not just what Putin's been saying out loud, but privately to him, to Witkoff. And we did see Witkoff actually come out and say, hey, they want the 4 oblasts and whatever. It seemed like he understood that. But Witkoff is a team player. He's brought back online, and he's still, he after making some of those statements, he starts just repeating the party line.
How much longer do you think this war can go on if we're coming up against some hard realities? We've talked about the open admission that, the United States is running out of Patriot interceptors, and this is becoming a big problem. Trump apparently even told Zelensky, sorry, we're just out. And they're trying to get people to give some more to Ukraine, move them around. So there's this open admission, or we can get to the point where we just straight up run out completely. And then there's just this glaring huge problem, that we're talking about wanting to defend Israel or go to war with Iran or attack China, when all of a sudden it's like, oops, we ran out of all these missiles just by supplying Ukraine. Or the other thing as well is just the manpower, the horrific fact that Ukraine is running out of men to fight this war. You were talking about, there's talks about starting to conscript women in the fall. If all of a sudden we're forcing women off the street to go to die in some trench on the front, like that's, come on, it's getting to the point where it's just, will it get to that point? Will it get to that? Do you think it'll get to the point where we actually just straight up run out of munitions, certain types of munitions, or we get to the point where we actually are forcing Ukrainian women to try to fight this war?
Well, first on the question of munitions, that's already happening. It is already a huge problem. And let's not forget that just a week ago, the administration was saying that we have to suspend shipments of certain kinds of weapons because they're at a critically low level. Now they're kind of obfuscating what they said, but I think that's just the reality. There was an article that came out in well, we can see it as a reality for a different reason, but this article that came out in the Guardian a few days ago that said that actually, like, about Patriot interceptors in particular, that they're at 25% of the level that the U.S. considers adequate, for their own needs. So the U.S. has depleted their stockpiles to a very dangerous point, and they need to rebuild them. And we can see the reality in Ukraine. There have been attacks night after night on a larger scale than ever before. That's one part of the war that really has changed and has accelerated. The advances continue, and I think they're starting to gradually accelerate on the ground. But it's still, I think you can fairly characterize them as incremental. It's still the lava flow. There aren't any huge breakthroughs or rapid advances. We're not seeing that, but the advances are important on the ground. But in the air, we have seen just a notable escalation. We're at record-breaking attacks. Just the other night there was something like 700 drones and missiles that not all of them struck their targets, but a very large percentage did within Ukraine. And you just see a near total absence of air defense, especially against the missiles. They just can't do anything. I mean, they can get some of the drones down, but only a fraction of them. And places like Kiev, which are going to be the most heavily defended, one of the most heavily defended, if not the most heavily defended city in the country. You can see watch the videos. They're just coming in. There's nothing. There's no missile going up. There's only missiles coming down. And that tells you that they're out. They're just basically out. And then, Trump, after talking to Zelensky, Zelensky panicked when he heard that these shipments were going to be suspended. Trump said, well, I'll send you 10 more interceptors. 10 more interceptors is like enough for 15 minutes on one of these nights. I mean, really. You're supposed to fire 2. Each of these, I think the more expensive kinds are $7 million each. And, you have 5 incoming missiles. All 10 of them are going to be used up, very easily in one night. Very, very
no
easily.
Guarantee that they actually...
Yeah, they're even going to hit them, right? That's exactly right. They don't, especially if they're Kinjals or I think the Iskander M's are proving to be very, very difficult to bring down. They have new evasive measures that they use. That tells you, there's been a lot of talk like, Trump, the administration, they walked back this statement on pausing shipments. I don't see evidence of that. I mean, there's under pressure. They say, we're going to keep on sending them missiles, but they haven't said, we're going to send all those particular items, that we said we were going to suspend. I have not seen a denial of that. And just Trump's statement about sending 10 interceptors tells you that, what they said earlier wasn't a political decision. They're talking about reality. They have come up against a hard limit, and it's just very limited as what they can do. Now think about it, like in the Middle East, the THAADs were used to defend Israel. Apparently, somebody put this recently, like 15 to 20% of all THAADs in the world were used during those 12 days to defend Israel from missile attacks from Iran.
Not very effectively. I'm
sure I'm sure they brought down some, but clearly, a significant number of Iranian missiles made it through and did significant damage. But if you actually look at how few of these THAAD missiles are made every year, somebody, maybe this is an exaggeration, but it said that essentially they lost like 8 years worth of production. I've seen different figures. Like it
wouldn't surprise me in 12 days, less than 2 weeks.
Some people say they can just make a dozen a year. I've heard up to 50, but whatever it is, we're talking about years of, like at least 2 years of production. In just this 12-day war, and that gives you a sense of the the really precarious situation that the U.S. is in with relative to its, its stockpiles.
Yeah, did you see that video Pete Hegseth in front of the Pentagon with these drones and saying how the U.S. is going to be the leader in drone warfare attack?
Yeah,
Did you see that?
I heard about it, but I didn't actually see the video.
Okay, I'll send it to you later. It's so cringy, but to me it was just clear that the U.S. was just trying to stay relevant and try to act tough. But this video to me had the opposite effect. It's like, man, these kids, they're playing with like little toy drones. You got four of them. Like, actions speak louder than words, America. And what we can see is that we don't have any industrial capacity. We can't build things that are effective in a modern war. At least at any. I mean, even if we were building at scale some of these interceptors, I just don't. It doesn't seem like they're working very well. I mean, I think there was that one Iranian missile that we saw that I think 14 interceptors were fired at it. Not a single one hit it. Like I think it was something Ted Postal analyzed and looked at. It's like that's
I recall some, particular incident.
So how does this all end? What does this mean for the war in Ukraine? How does this finish? I mean,
well, I think that it seems like, well, first of all, that the administration never stopped supporting Ukraine. There was those few days, I believe it was in March, where they applied pressure. And then that was it. After that, the pipeline, was opened up again. The weapons flowed, and then there's always been this very important intelligence and reconnaissance support and other forms of support. Those really never stopped. And now we're getting, the first Trump weapons being put into the pipeline. I think the pipeline will continue to flow, and the other support will continue as it is. Trump does not want to have an Afghanistan happen on his watch, but I don't know that he can avoid it, because they are the U.S. Even with all the weapons, of course, that were sent to Ukraine under Biden, the Ukraine's position just steadily deteriorated. We can see, especially with regard to air defense, but all along the line too. They are falling back, and this is going to continue. So even if, let's say, theoretically, let's just imagine that the U.S. continued to supply weapons at the rate that was being supplied under Biden, it wouldn't change the inevitable. It would not prevent an inevitable Ukraine defeat. It's just going to happen. But the reality is that we don't have it. We're running out. So we're going to be drawing munitions from monthly production runs. The stockpiles have been depleted, and so they'll continue to receive them, but it'll be a trickle, rather than a flood, and that is just only going to accelerate the collapse of Ukraine. And Ukraine has other problems, manpower and motivation problems too. You can see, the people that are being sent to the front line really don't want to be there by and large. So I don't see that he can prevent the collapse. Now, whether it's going to take it'll be an Afghan style collapse or it'll be a slower collapse, remains to be seen. But there will be a collapse regardless, and that's something that he's trying to avoid. And I think everybody else in the administration is trying to avoid. Probably the idea is try to kick the can down the road. It would have to be another 3.5 years, basically, or 3 years, right? 3.5 years, right?
It's not going to make it that long.
I don't think that's highly unlikely. I mean, the Ukrainians have hung in there longer than I think a lot of us expected, but there are increasing signs that they're coming to the end of their rope. And I think like within a year, or we'll just put it that way, it could be a lot earlier, it could even be like the end of the summer, but within a year that we'll see some form of true collapse. And that'll be in the middle of his administration. Now we'll see what can he do. I don't think he can do much about it other than actually trying to send, NATO troops in. And we've talked about this. That's not impossible. That's the scary moment when we get to that. When Trump says, "Oh my God, they're going to have, they're going to blame me for this. I'm looking weak. We've got to do something." He could be talked into doing that, and then things become very, very scary. But Yeah, we're not there yet,
Oof.
but I don't think that's very far in the future.
Ugh. John Mearsheimer, he predicts a frozen conflict. Is that what you think as well would happen? That Russia will stop and then the conflict will get frozen?
Yeah, I think he's right that when Russia, achieves their objectives, we know that the minimum is the four oblasts, but I think because, again, the Ukrainians have and the West have refused to negotiate, it's going to be more than that. They've already, strongly implied that, that it's going to be more. I don't see them actually giving up. They're going to get at least the very least, at least the four oblasts and the land that they have taken in places like Kharkov and now in Dnipropetrovsk. Um, but probably it's going to be more than that. They're probably going to take, this will be challenging, but the southern part of Ukraine, Odessa and Nikolaev, those are historically Russian areas and strategically very important because they border the Black Sea. And by taking those, they can deprive Ukraine of access to the Black Sea, where Ukraine has done a certain amount of damage to the Russian Navy. So I think they have a strategic incentive, but also kind of a cultural incentive to take those areas. Now it's going to be more difficult because they do have to cross the Dnieper. But if they're going to take Kherson, they're going to have to do that anyway. So once they get on the other side, and they've declared that all of Kherson is theirs, well, they're going to have to take Kherson City. That's on the other side. It's on the right bank of the Dnieper, and then I think it's likely that they'll at least take those two, and then probably Sumy and Kharkov as well, up in the north, and maybe more. Maybe they'll even go all the way to Kiev. We don't know, but at some point they're going to say, well, we've achieved our strategic objectives. We've now so thoroughly weakened Ukraine that it's not going to be a threat to us for many years to come. We'll stop here, and probably, like Mearsheimer says, that Ukraine will never surrender because it's in the grips of this ultra-nationalism, in the grips of the Banderites. So it'll just be a frozen conflict, which is not really good for everybody. Now, the problem is that Ukraine will be clearly defeated and have become a greatly weakened country. But you have people there that are not going to give up, and they're going to continue to conduct terrorist operations within Russia, and that'll put pressure on Russia to respond and maybe to take further territory, at least to continue the missile strikes.
We talked about this before, that Russia might be sort of changing its posture with the Ukraine war and viewing it more as a counterterrorism operation. And we saw an assassination of a Ukrainian, I don't know what position, but a Ukrainian military commander, relatively high up. I was just listening.
He was in intelligence, the SBU. So he was a high-ranking commander, a colonel in the SBU.
Right. So the way you're talking about it, going into a frozen conflict, and then you'll have sort of this hotbed of potential terrorist activities, drone attacks, potential assassinations. That really, Russia is already sort of evolving its way of handling the situation with the counterterrorism operation. So we're going to maybe see that shift begin to accelerate the further it begins to get approach Banderite territory, and it's like, okay, now it will be doing things like what they did here. They took out this, this assassination type of thing.
Yeah.
Do you think that's how you deal with counterterrorism? Is that what Russia's?
Well, possibly. But, first it must be said that the Russians haven't acknowledged this. And so we don't know for a fact that the Russians carried out this assassination. But I think we have reason to believe. I think probably they did. It's something that they intimated they might do. This guy apparently was involved, helped to organize terrorist attacks within Russia. So he does seem like a likely target. So probably it was the Russians. And, is this part of it going to be an increasingly frequent event? It may be, or is it just a one-off thing? It's just maybe kind of a warning shot. And the Russians will see, if these terrorist attacks subside. We don't know. We really don't know. Yeah, it's something that again, we don't know for a fact that they did do this. It could have been, there are a lot of rivalries within these organizations in Ukraine, so it could have been a rival, a Ukrainian rival. But I let's just say, it does seem to have the fingerprints of Russia on it, or it seems likely. Um, and they, clearly they can do a lot. They've refrained from doing it in the past, but they have, as you can see from these missile strikes, they know what's going on, who's where, and they strike these various buildings, with great precision. Buildings that are often disguised as something else, but they know what's going on inside these buildings. That tells you that they have a significant intelligence network. Because there's no question, but there are a lot of Russian sympathizers, within Ukraine, on Ukrainian territory, and they are willing to work for Russia, and that's not going to change for the foreseeable future. So they can. Yeah, they could go after more people, say we have avoided this in the past, but you pushed too far, too many terrorist attacks. Now you people that are organizing these attacks are going to have to pay the price.
Right. Yeah. I've heard reports that there are a lot of people in Ukraine. Probably the most hated organization currently in Ukraine is the TCC. It's the forced conscription units that go around in these vans and grab people off the streets and beat them up and throw them to the front line. So I've heard Ukrainian citizens have been sending information about the location of these TCC people, where they are, who they are, to Russia, so Russia could take them out. And right. I'm just, in general, we've seen assassinations that the United States and Israel commit regularly, and they're heinous acts, and they always seem to be counterproductive. And they seem to have the opposite effect, like we saw in Iran, the rallying around the flag effect. But maybe what we have here in Ukraine is that, if these people are just under such an oppressive regime and are being forced off the streets, like you said, there is this sort of a rebellious group that could be grown within Ukraine to help, defeat these things. And this is, I don't condone assassinations, but in my mind, it's almost more moral to do this than what we see, this forced conscription and sending these people that don't want to fight to the front line. Let's take out these evil people that are involved in these terrorist organizations that are oppressing the Ukrainian people, that, are forcing them off of these, to die for a cause that they don't believe in here, so yeah, maybe that's how it's going to, do you think that's kind of how it's going to play out? We're going to have this.
Well, you're right. This is something that maybe these attacks on the TCC, it is a part of a new policy, but it seems to be very carefully calibrated, the attacking groups that are unpopular within Ukraine. And so they're not going after what's happening in Iran. The head of the IRGC or, the supreme leader himself.
That's like going after the Pope, right? If you try to kill Ayatollah, it's like, that's crazy.
Yeah, right. No, it's really horrific. And apparently they were after almost the entire civilian leadership. That's what the Iranians say. That's what Pezeshkian himself said, that that night there were missile strikes very close to where he was, and he believes they were going after him. And the Iranians have, and there's, we can't know that for sure, but there's really not much reason to doubt it. Look at the other targets that they went after. It was an attempt at just a total decapitation. Now, first of all, the Russians have been in this for 3 years, and they haven't done anything. And they have suffered some horrific, terrorist attacks, particularly the Crocus City Hall, and have not responded in kind. And this is not responding in kind. It's not like they're carrying out terrorist attacks within Ukraine. Going after the TCC, that's a legitimate military target. And
it's also popular amongst the Ukrainians.
Yeah, right. And I think, too, like the SBU is not popular. I think they're involved in a lot of, it's a counterintelligence group that's involved in a lot of repressive activities within Ukraine. So it may be that we'll see these very carefully calibrated attacks, assassinations and on, within certain organizations that are known not to have the support of the Ukrainian people.
Right. And then that would slowly actually begin to paint Russia in a more favorable light, do you think, to a majority of Ukrainian people? Because,
Yeah,
I just saw this video of a woman that died trying to save her son, that was being put into
yeah.
these vans. It's
Right. There
like,
has to be a lot of anger. It's hard for people to express their feelings openly, or even I think to like in that kind of atmosphere, a war atmosphere, to even think clearly. But when the war ends, I think that, and if that's really lifted, but we don't know, we still have the ultranationalists in charge. Um, who knows? Because we've seen in the past, like countries that have been defeated, actually, when it's all over, even in like in the Confederacy here in the U.S., when it's over, there was a lot of anger against their own government because they said, we supported you because we thought that there was a chance for victory, and now we've lost like more than half of our women are widowed now. And what did we get? We have all these smoking ruins. So there's just this anger, They're not that they really love the invader, but there can be anger directed at the government that they had been supporting. I don't want to make a comparison between the Confederacy and the Banderites in Ukraine, but I'm just just it's a limited comparison there. So yeah, that's certainly possible, and also just I think it must be affecting the thinking of Ukrainians, like when they see what's happening in places like Mariupol. It's being rebuilt. People are obviously doing much, much better in places that were conquered by the Russians than within Ukraine itself. And then, of course, part of that is because, missiles are not raining down on Russian-held territory. But that's just part of the reality. But obviously, the Russians are trying to make life better for these people. They're new citizens and are having success. And, actually, beyond what even prior to the war you saw in Ukraine. Ukraine is, ever since it's gained its independence in was 1991, it's just been a very, very corrupt society. And it's struggled ever since the beginning. It's like they never got out of the 90s there. And Ukrainians just have to, maybe it's not, it really dawned on them yet, but they've got to, you would think it would stop and say, hey, if I was on the other side of the line, things really could be better for me. Sort of like what happened too in China, there was the remarkable success of Taiwan in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. The Chinese themselves were looking over there and saying, I think we took the wrong turn somewhere, right? And so that led to real changes of policy. I don't know if these people in Ukraine are capable of that, but you think about it. I mean, the crazies ran the show in China for a while, and then they were booted out, and then people that were, certainly members of the Communist Party, but they looked at the reality and changed course. I don't know if the Ukrainians are capable of that. Talking about the Ukrainian government is capable of that or not, but maybe. We'll
right.
see.
I mean, it's a little more complicated with Ukraine as well because it's being propped up by the entire Western world. So, like, the
Yeah,
Western
right.
world's got to let go too. It's not just
Yeah,
Ukraine.
right, right, right. Again, this war would never have happened if it wasn't. It would have ended if it was just a war between Russia and Ukraine. It would have ended the first year. It's just that, but this constant flow of weapons and support has kept the current regime going, and but again to the detriment of Ukraine. Yeah, right. And maybe that will just continue. That's they're like Mearsheimer is very pessimistic about the long term. He doesn't doubt that there's going to be a Russian victory, but he's very pessimistic about Ukraine, and it just may continue to be a festering sore that the war may never fully end, because they'll keep on striking out and the Russians will be forced to respond.
And you agree with
Well,
Mearsheimer?
I think yeah, unfortunately, unfortunately, I think he's probably right. But that the agony of Ukraine is going to continue even past a frozen conflict. I, I, it's not a certainty. Again, these countries do have agency. And there, maybe there can be a new um, elite, will arise within Ukraine, but we just don't see any signs of it right now.
Okay. We've gone a bit long, but I just want to ask one quick question. Do you
Okay.
see any sign of Israel-Iran starting back up?
Not immediate sign. I think, again, Israel, I don't think anybody has actually contradicted this, but Israel was really, and the U.S. were the ones that wanted to end this war. And I think it's because of the missile problem. They were coming to the end of their stockpiles. And, they had a defense. Again, let's remind ourselves, it's not just like the Israeli air defense that was protecting Israel. It was the Israeli air defense plus U.S., plus France, plus UK, plus Jordan. The Iranian missiles had to make it through all, but I think all of them were running out of munitions. And eventually, if they run out, then it becomes easy. The Ukrainians can start just sending drones. The drones are much easier to shoot down. I think the vast majority of drones that the Ukrainians sent were shot down, and probably the Iranians were aware of that, and they did that purposely just to deplete the interceptor stockpiles. But yeah, so now these stockpiles are way down, and it's going to take time because we've talked about the very limited productive capacity of the West. It's going to take a long time to build them up again. So I think that does put that means that we probably have at least some months before there's another attack. Now the thing is, Iran, I'm sure, is not staying still, and they're going to be trying to plug the holes in their own air defense. Maybe it's going to be harder to do that because it was a more limited, a weaker system to begin with. We've learned and was clearly to some significant degree degraded by the Israelis, but they don't need air defense as much as the Israelis do because they're a much larger country, and they can take many more blows than Israel can. Israel is a small country, and we saw that so like every blow, that every missile impact has much more of an overall impact, on the economy, on the psyche, on the military within Israel than let's say the equivalent strike within Iran. Iran is just can absorb many, many more blows. Israel can't. So they're really dependent on air defense. And uh, of course, Iran would do well to improve there. But I think the main thing that they need to do, I'm, just looking this, speculating as a layman, is really to build up, make sure that they have the missiles, which I believe they do. If anything, if what we've heard beforehand is that all true, they still have many, many missiles, but they may need to actually improve their launch systems, or increase the number of launchers, and find ways to protect them so that they can start dealing the same heavy blows to Israel. And if that's the case, Israel goes into another war, and this time they don't have the advantage of surprise. They probably don't have another Operation Rising Lion. I don't think that's possible to do that again. Imagine that the Iranians are rolling up all these clandestine networks within their country. They launch an attack. They won't have that initial advantage, and then in 2 weeks' time, they're going to be out of these interceptors again, and then they just have open skies, and the Iranians just can keep on going. I've heard that actually there's a lot of criticism within Iran about accepting the ceasefire. They felt like, we should have just kept on going. We had them on the ropes.
That's what that's how I think most of the world felt, to be honest. And it's not our position to say, Iran's a sovereign country and it was getting hit and it would suffer a very devastating blow at the beginning. But it was just, to be able to see Israel get a taste of its own medicine was, I think it was something that the whole world needed, and
Right.
we want to see more of it. But you're right. Israel and the United States, they're the ones that called it off. That should mean that they should be afraid to start it back up. But that they want to, but they just don't have the means. So I'm just worried that they're just scheming. I know they're racing 24/7, coming up with all types of plans.
Yeah.
What can we do? What can we do? Okay, we can't do it this way. There's some other way.
Like Mossad has shown itself to be is a very formidable organization, very imaginative. So maybe they do have another trick up their sleeves.
Right. Well, I'm sure they're trying. They're scheming. But yeah, imagine how, if we spent all this time and attention and power working on making America better, just how much better, instead of all this energy, all this intellectual energy, all this money, just everything, all these resources for death and destruction in the Middle East or in some other place. Like, in China, I could take the high-speed rail from Shanghai to Beijing in like 4.5 hours for $70, and I could go anywhere. It's so great. Everything was so sleek and modern and fast. And then I come back to the United States, and it's like, can't get potholes fixed. Everything costed an insane amount. It's like, why? Why don't we invest here? Spend all that intention, all that brain power, all that scheming, just to make life better for us Americans. Like, that's your job. It's so frustrating. I'm getting so pissed, and I know that this is a sentiment that is being shared by more and more Americans every day. And just, I want to see change. I don't see any change, so I guess I want to see collapse at this point.
Yeah, when you see the same thing in Europe, it's clear that the common people in Europe do not want so many resources being devoted to the war. They want their own needs met at home. It's not a popular move, but you just have these governments that really ignore the will of the people, and we'll see how long they can do that, or if it.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, Dad. Yeah, I feel like I'm learning so much more just in these talks than like everything I spent in college. I feel like I have to delete everything I learned in higher education.
Well,
Okay,
I'm
Dad.
glad to hear that.
All right. Thanks a bunch. Have a great weekend.
Okay, you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.